Hello, everyone. Hi. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks very much for coming to this special event live on the YouTubes. Thank you very much to the History Hit team for hosting us today. We are going to be watching a film, what we made, the Story of Egyptology, a film we made earlier this year. I thought it was worth just putting a little event together like this so that we could all watch the film at the same time. Little kind of celebration, sort of party, launch party kind of thing for it. And give you out there a chance to send us your comments and your questions, your heckles, your jeers and cheers, whatever it is you have that you think about the film. We've got a lot of people, I think, joining us already. I gather that we've got people from around the world, from the UK, of course, but also from countries as far away as Egypt, Brazil, USA, Malta, Denmark, Mexico. So thank you all for coming, especially if you're in a part of the world that means that this is an inconvenient time for you. Thank you especially for joining us live. So we're gonna show the film. You can post your comments in the chat thingy. I have to say a big special thank you to the History Hit tech team, because when I originally discussed this watch along party with Mark and Milo here, my original plan was just to host this myself via Zoom. But the finely tuned instruments over at History Hit detected a distinct lack of technical expertise, and so the team stepped in and agreed to host this. This means, of course, that everything is going to be much slicker than my normal events, but it does also mean that I don't really know how it all works. So anyway, hopefully it'll all be self-explanatory. Pop your comments, etc., into the chat. Those will be moderated by Louis and Owen behind the scenes, and we, the team, the three amigos of the Story of Egyptology, will be taking your questions at the end. So it's not just me. I'm joined this evening by Mark Edger, the director and producer of the film, and also by Milo Cumpstey, our director of photography. I'm not sure I've ever had more fun on a shoot making a film than I did with these guys. It was a real pleasure to work with them in a very cold week in January in London this year. And that's, I've got to say, that's part of the reason why I'm so keen to do this event, just because I wanted an excuse to work with them again, see them again. So here we are. As I say, we'll be taking your questions. Guys, should we do sort of little intros now? Milo, do you want to say a quick hi?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to all the History Hit crew as well. Like Chris said, it was a really fun project to work on. Fascinating subject matter. We went to some great locations. I learned so much in making this, and can't believe you got paid to do it. It was mega. So it's just so nice to be able to share it with everyone, because quite often you make something, you don't always get to see or hear people's reactions from it. So this is a good part of that. And yeah, I really hope all the viewers really enjoy it, because it was a fascinating subject, really good to make, and yeah, all sort of Mark and Chris's brainchild. So nice to be along for the ride.
And the boss, Mark, do you want to say a quick hello?
Yeah, hello. I'm not so sure about the boss, but that's very kind of you. So yeah, hi, I'm Mark. I was the producer and director on this project. It was a real pleasure to work with Chris and Milo. Yeah, we had a great time, a cold time, especially after I told Chris not to wear a jumper the whole time. He did wear one in the end, but it probably wasn't enough. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the film. It was really fun to make. And of course, if you do enjoy it, then please make sure that you subscribe to this YouTube channel, and of course you can head over to the History Hit TV site as well. And as a YouTube subscriber, you get 50% off your first 3 months at History Hit TV with the code YouTube. So yeah, if you do like great history, like this Egypt film that we made, then definitely check that out for more of the same.
Okay, great stuff. So should we watch the film? Should we get them to put the tape in and press play? I guess we should. Okay, guys. So here we go. I hope you enjoy the film, and see you in an hour or so for the Q&A. A 100 years ago, newsreel cameras captured a glimpse at the archaeological discovery of a generation. Audiences worldwide were whisked across the oceans to the land of the pharaohs, pyramids, and the Sphinx, where the body of a king had been found. Tutankhamun. The Boy King's death mask captured the imagination of millions and continues to do so today. And it inspired countless numbers to make a career in the field of Egyptology, just like me. I'm Dr. Chris Naunton, and I've worked as an Egyptologist for almost 20 years. But what fascinates me almost as much as the history of ancient Egypt is the history of Egyptology itself. Tutankhamun might be the first name that comes to mind when you think of Egyptology, but in fact the discovery of his tomb is just one chapter in the long and fascinating story of men and women who dedicated their lives to uncovering the incredible world of ancient Egypt. It's a story filled with some of the most unlikely characters, from circus strongmen to military leaders, and it's packed with war, treasure, and a sprinkling of genius. This is the story of Egyptology. Ancient Egypt has been the subject of study for almost 4,000 years. It was started by the Egyptians themselves and then followed by the Greeks, Romans, and Arab scholars. But such a spectacular and important ancient civilization was bound to gain recognition further afield. By the 16th century, a few brave European souls bitten by the travel and exploration bug had started to venture across the Mediterranean and to Egypt. And one of the first of these was the Englishman George Sand. In 1610, George embarked on a tour that saw him eventually setting foot on the shores of Egypt. And when he arrived back in England, he wrote an account of his travels, the relation of a journey begun in Anno Domini 1610 in 4 books. This is a very early edition of Sand's account, one of the earliest European encounters with Egypt. And it makes me think I can remember very well the first time I went to Egypt, and I wasn't breaking ground like somebody like Sands was, but it was still pretty exciting. I can't imagine what it would have been like 4 centuries ago when hardly anybody had been to Egypt. But if anything, Sands seems slightly underwhelmed by his first encounters with the country. He's writing here about the present state of Alexandria, which is the city he arrived at. He calls it the Queen of Cities and the metropolis of Africa. But of what he finds, he writes, of antiquities, there are few reminders, only an hieroglyphical obelisk of Theban marble, as hard well nigh as porphyr, but of a deeper red and speckled alike, called Pharaoh's Needle, standing where once stood the palace of Alexander, and another lying by and like it, half buried in rubbish. That's not the last time we'll hear of those obelisks. In any case, Sand's disappointment wasn't going to last. According to his own account, after Alexandria, Sands travelled to Rosetta, and from there down a branch of the Nile to Cairo. From Cairo, he then wasted very little time before he visited Giza. And this is what we get in this section of the account. This is really exciting. It's full of Sand's vivid descriptions of his first encounter with what, of course, is one of the ancient wonders of the world. It's one of the great, most famous archaeological sites anywhere. It's one of the first places I visited when I went to Egypt for the first time. The pyramids and the Sphinx are really very clearly visible in his drawing here, along with an intrepid-looking band of locals on horseback.
The Sphinx itself looks perhaps not as we would expect. It appears as kind of disembodied head, but then as Sands tells us, the statue was buried up to its neck in drift sand at this point. So it would have looked very different to the Sphinx that we know today. Sands went tramping all over the site, and he tells us about all the things he learned, the size of the blocks the pyramids were built from, various other tales that attach themselves to the pyramids and the Sphinx. And he even, as he tells us here, went inside one of the pyramids. There's a great sense of the excitement that Sands must have experienced when he entered the pyramid for the first time, and it's all over the account and the language that he uses. He says at one point on entering the pyramid, "This entry was of an exceeding height, yet no broader from side to side that a man may fathom, benched on each side and closed above with admirable architecture, the marble so great and so cunningly joined as it had been hewn through the living rock." And this is accompanied by an illustration, a drawing of his, which shows us the exterior of the pyramid and the point at which you can enter it. I recognise it very well. It's a very good drawing, in fact. And you can see the internal architecture here and the layers of blocks on the exterior as well. And to think that if you were sitting in a library 3 or 4 centuries ago reading this account, when so little was known of this site, and there would have been so little by way of images of what there was to see in Egypt, it would have been just magical to read something like this and to be sort of temporarily transported to Giza, imagining these things. It's really fantastical.
Sands' account was well received, and it was still being published long after his death. And even by the end of the 17th century, it was still one of the very few first-hand accounts of travel to Egypt.
Sands was a pioneer in visiting Egypt, and his account, however rudimentary it might seem to us now, helped lay the foundations for Egyptology. And as an Egyptologist myself, I find this really quite magical, actually. When I started studying Egyptology 20 odd years ago, there was so much already known, but for Sands, everything here was new and mysterious. He had classical accounts with him, but very, very little else was known. He was among the first to start gathering information together. There was so much discovery to come, so much accumulation of knowledge ahead of him. This is the very beginning of my discipline of Egyptology.
A small but steady trickle of Westerners followed in Sands' footsteps, some using his book as a guide. But instead of just writing and drawing what they saw, some began to bring back small souvenirs.
As the Age of Enlightenment continued in Europe, it became fashionable for people wanting to show off their intellect and how interesting they were to have a cabinet of curiosities. And this would be a collection of intriguing objects, anything from stuffed animals to fossils, and increasingly archaeological objects. So as more and more people travelled to Egypt and began to see what fascinating things there were to be seen there, more and more Egyptian objects started making their way into collections.
What found its way to Britain was a small collection of fantastic, if slightly strange, archaeological oddities. Items taken for their novelty factor, certainly not understood nor contextualised. But it was pieces like these that would start one of the greatest Egyptian antiquary collections in the world.
In 1753, an Act of Parliament was passed creating the British Museum, and it was formed primarily of the 71,000 objects left to the nation by Sir Hans Sloane on his death. To give you an idea of just how rare and unusual Egyptian objects were in Britain at that time, of those 71,000 artefacts, just 150 of them came from Egypt.
Before the British Museum formally opened in 1759, further objects were added to the Egyptian collection. But the museum was still dominated by Greek vases and Roman statues, the ancient world a bit closer to home. The small number of fairly random Egyptological items reflected just how little was known of Egypt. and just how much there was still to be discovered.
However, within 50 years of the British Museum opening, interest in ancient Egypt was to be catapulted forward and Egyptology revolutionised by someone we normally associate more with warfare and politics than with archaeology: Napoleon Bonaparte.
On the 1st of July 1798, 50,000 men under Napoleon's command arrived in Egypt. He declared they were there to protect French trade interests. Perhaps the disruption of British access to the Indian subcontinent was just a happy coincidence. This mighty Armée d'Orient was not just furnished with soldiers and sailors, but also a group of 167 so-called savants. Napoleon had brought scholars along too.
There were geologists, engineers, surveyors, cartographers, and they were all there in theory to support the army with logistics, but in practice they were going to document everything they saw, in particular the historic monuments. The savants were in Egypt for 3 years before the French armies were finally defeated by a coalition of the British and Ottomans, and it would take a further 2 decades for them to gather together all the material. The end product is this, the Description de l'Égypte. This is a part of the 2nd edition. There were 26 volumes of text in this edition and 11 of these enormous volumes of illustrations. And all the sites that the savants encountered are given the same incredibly detailed treatment. So take a site like Edfu, which is a place I'm familiar with. I've visited a few times myself. It's a temple dedicated to Horus. We've got a nice general view here showing the temple in its natural setting. We've got palm trees and hills in the distance, a few men on horseback in the corner for scale. But then, as we continue, we have technical drawings. So there's a plan drawing here, minutely accurate detail, measurements going into this plan of the temple, section drawings as well here showing the internal architecture. There's a front elevation drawing we can see here, which shows us a bit more of the architecture, but also the decoration as well, the very beautiful relief decoration. And there's a great amount of detail in this, you know, figures and figures and figures of gods and goddesses, symmetrical images on either side, the king smiting his enemies. And this is giving us a sense of the sort of detail of the decoration here. As we can see from the scale down here in the bottom right-hand corner, this isn't just a sort of impressionist drawing, this is a technical, accurate, specialist drawing. They are capturing every detail. This is the same pylon, but showing the interior. There's a staircase, it turns out, inside, which would allow people to go to the top. We've got a view inside the first court here, which is quite different architecturally, so we can get a sense of these beautifully detailed column capitals and screen walls, winged sun disk above the door frames here. I mean, it's almost difficult to see it, but the detail of the relief decoration all around is all drawn in. I mean, every one of these drawings is a kind of a work of art in its own right. There's an academic level of interest here. This isn't perhaps quite Egyptology as a science just yet, but it's certainly closer than anything that had gone before. These volumes provided scholars back in Europe for the first time with accurate and to scale images of the great monuments of the Nile Valley. And anybody looking at these illustrations couldn't fail to have been blown away by what they saw. By this time, a smattering of objects had been leaving Egypt and making their way into European collections, but nothing on this scale. The Description de l'Égypte really lit the fires of Egyptology. For the first time, Egypt was no longer a faraway, mysterious, inaccessible place, but somewhere that you could visit from the comfort of a Parisian library.
The Description opened Egypt up like never before. It was a guidebook for budding explorers, a priceless resource for new scholars of Egyptology, and a catalogue for wide-eyed antiquarians. The objects that had been making their way back to the Louvre and the British Museum were nothing like the monumental scale of the treasures in the Description de l'Egypte. France was now at the forefront of Egyptological exploration. But across the Channel, Great Britain, France's great enemy, was not willing to sit back and let them have this advantage without a fight.
So, something of an archaeological arms race started. Neither side wanting to be outdone, both sides wanting to stock their still relatively new museums full of the finest things Egypt had to offer. And both of them set about recruiting teams not just to record what was in Egypt, but to carry the treasure off as well.
And into this race stepped a man who has become one of the great names in the field of Egyptology. A man who had perhaps the most remarkable career of anyone in my field. The former circus performer and Italian engineer, Giovanni Battista Belzoni. In 1815, finding himself in Egypt and looking for work, he was recommended to the British Consul General, Henry Salt, who needed a man to help lift some rather heavy objects. Salt was, in the spirit of the British-French rivalry, desperate to collect the very finest antiquities that Egypt had to offer and that he could ship back to Britain. At a healthy profit for himself, of course. He quickly signed Belzoni up, and within weeks, he was changing the landscape of Egypt.
Some of the star pieces in the British Museum collection today were recovered by Belzoni, and one of the very finest stands at the heart of the collection. It's the bust of the so-called younger Memnon.
Napoleon's men had attempted to move the Colossus in 1798, but where they failed, Belzoni succeeded. It was an astonishing feat of engineering and a huge coup for the British. The enormous bust arrived in 1818 to great fanfare. Newspapers raved about it, and it inspired Shelley to write his poem Ozymandias.
I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair."
For the first time, Egyptian sculpture was considered to be a work of art, at the same table as that of the Greeks and Romans. No longer would curious trinkets satisfy the great European collections. They all wanted a younger Memnon of their own. And so, with the Description de l'Egypte as a map, Egypt began to be systematically stripped of its treasures. And Belzoni was at the heart of it. For the next few years, Belzoni crisscrossed Egypt on the hunt for new treasures. He dug his way into the temple at Abu Simbel and found monumental statues at Karnak. But, still hungry for more, he turned his attention to the Valley of the Kings.
The Valley of the Kings is one of those places that you've perhaps heard of, but possibly don't know a great deal about. When you think of the burials of Egyptian kings, you might think about pyramids of Giza perhaps. And yes, Egyptian kings were buried in pyramids, but over 1,000 years later they were being buried somewhere else, out in the Valley of the Kings, which is not one great valley, actually it's a network of little mini valleys, wadis, out to the west of the ancient city of Thebes. And it was here that the tombs of the kings were cut and then filled with treasure. In Belzoni's time, only about a dozen of these tombs were known, but thanks to Belzoni and others like him, that was quickly going to change.
Over the next few years, he discovered a number of stunning royal tombs, but the single-minded Belzoni remained focused on finding more.
By now, Belzoni had made more discoveries than most people could ever dream of, and yet, still, he wasn't satisfied. He continued his excavations until he found what he was looking for: the largest, most complex, most beautifully decorated tomb in the whole of the Valley of the Kings, the Tomb of Seti I.
The tomb walls were covered in beautiful, brightly coloured imagery of which Belzoni took careful note. But the jewel at the heart of the complex was this magnificent sarcophagus.
It was, and still is, an absolutely sensational find. It's a single, massive piece of Egyptian alabaster hollowed out so that it could receive the body of the king himself. It's completely covered on all surfaces, inside and out, in inscriptions, hieroglyphs, images of the king, gods and goddesses. Even the stone itself has these lovely kind of striations. It's exquisite, absolutely perfect.
Belzoni didn't just want money, but recognition too. He was prepared even to carve his name into this priceless artifact, to leave us in no doubt that this was a Belzoni find. Despite his amazing contribution to the field, he still felt outside the academic Egyptological world. Mocked for incorrect attributions of statues and undervalued by his benefactors. And so, instead of pandering to them, Belzoni brought Egyptology to the general public.
In 1821, Belzoni put on his very own exhibition, not just anywhere, but here in the heart of London, on Piccadilly, in the Grand Egyptian Hall. He filled it full of brightly painted plaster casts of reliefs from the Valley of the Kings and fantastical objects he'd excavated himself. He transported the public across the seas from London to ancient Egypt, and it was a massive success.
On the first day alone, almost 2,000 people came to visit his exhibition. It didn't matter what the boffins thought. Belzoni was the talk of the town.
There's no doubt that Belzoni was an utterly remarkable man, and he was responsible for revealing some of the most spectacular monuments to have survived from ancient Egypt. But he did all this at a time when archaeology, if you can call it that, was almost completely unregulated. He removed masses of antiquities from the ground, and his processes were undocumented and uncontrolled. On the other hand, he did make records of at least the Tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings. He published an account of his travels, his adventures. He put on an exhibition here, and you could argue that all of that was for the good of scholarship and all about circulating knowledge to people. But was it? Or was it more about self-promotion and making money? There's no question that this was a very, very important moment in the history of Egyptology. Belzoni was crucial, but it's all a bit problematic.
Egypt was now more accessible to more people than ever before. And not just in Egypt itself, but back at home too. Egyptomania was sweeping the Western world. From literature to architecture, ancient Egypt was the fashionable choice. Buildings across the UK were being built in an Egyptian style, and anyone who was anyone wanted either a Sphinx or an obelisk to complement their country home.
It wasn't just museums that housed Egyptian antiquities. The centres of European cities now became places to display the treasures of Egypt's past. Paris had the Luxor obelisk in the Place de la Concorde, and not wanting to be outdone, London had Cleopatra's Needle.
This obelisk was originally erected in the Egyptian city of Heliopolis in around 1450 BC, some 1400 years before Cleopatra was even born. It was moved in 12 BC to Alexandria, to a temple built by Cleopatra. It was here that the obelisk and its twin became something of a landmark, noted and drawn by hundreds of travellers, including our own pioneering George Sands in the early 1600s. Eventually, in 1819, it was gifted to the UK by the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali. And after years of fundraising, planning, and a tragic transportation that almost saw it lost in the Bay of Biscay, it finally arrived at its spot here on the Thames in 1878. The needle here and these Sphinx and camel benches that line the banks of the Thames really typify the Egyptomania of the 1800s. Tons and tons of Egyptian antiquities were being shipped to the West by people wanting to gather the very largest and finest collections of ancient objects. But there was something missing. All these incredible objects were covered in beguiling hieroglyphic inscriptions, and yet nobody could understand a word of it. But something was happening in Egyptology. While men like Belzoni and his contemporaries were out in the sands of Egypt, others were tucked away in the libraries of great European cities, not trying to work out where the next rich golden tomb would be, but what all this material actually meant.
Medieval Arab scholars worked hard to crack the code of hieroglyphs, as did scholars in Europe, although they had never even been to Egypt. The key to solving the puzzle wasn't discovered until 1799, and again, we have Napoleon's men to thank.
A French officer, Pierre-François Bouchard, was tasked with overhauling the old Ottoman fort, Fort Julian, in a town the French called Rosetta. During the works, he came across a stela with 3 distinct scripts on it. The Rosetta Stone. But with scholars on both sides of the channel having access to copies of the inscriptions, the race to crack the mystery of the hieroglyphs was on.
In the British corner, the polymath, the man described by his biographer as the last man who knew everything, Thomas Young. In the French corner, the expert linguist who by the age of 16 had learnt the language of the Egyptian Christians, the Copts, Coptic. This was Jean-François Champollion. Both these men knew that cracking hieroglyphs would be the greatest discovery for Egyptology, and they wouldn't even need to leave home to do it. The scale of the task facing Champollion and Young was enormous. And it didn't help that after a while they were pretty resentful of each other rather than helping each other out. Now the artifact that was obsessing them both, because they thought it was going to provide the key to the decipherment, was the Rosetta Stone. And I have a copy of the stone and its inscriptions here. What they knew was this. The text on the front of the stone appears in 3 different scripts. At the top, we have hieroglyphic, the script of the ancient Egyptian language. In the middle, Demotic, which is a kind of handwritten form of Egyptian. And then at the bottom, crucially, and very excitingly, ancient Greek. This was brilliant for them because Greek could be read at this time. So the assumption is that this is the same text, has the same meaning, written 3 different ways. So, given that they knew what the text in the Greek said, this would perhaps provide the key to understanding what the hieroglyphic text said as well. But it's not as straightforward as just being a kind of code. It's not as though the characters in the Greek match up exactly one character in Greek to one character in hieroglyphs. The problem was that Young and Champollion didn't know how hieroglyphs worked. Specifically, they didn't know whether the signs were purely symbolic. So does an image of a man sign mean a man? Does a bird mean bird, etc.? Or was it a kind of sound-based phonetic system like our own, in which the individual characters are used to convey the sounds of words or parts of the sounds of words? All these things stood in Young and Champollion's way, but undaunted, both of them set about the task of making Egyptological history.
An early breakthrough came when Young suggested that hieroglyphs might reveal phonetic values when they were used to write foreign words, like modern Chinese does. Now, being able to find a random word in hieroglyphs without even knowing how the system worked would be almost impossible. But Young had a secret weapon, the cartouche. It had been established that a cartouche, which had been so named by the French of Napoleon's expedition as it resembled the paper powder cartridges they used in their firearms, was used by the ancient Egyptians to enclose royal names. And so, Young was able to find the name Ptolemy, a ruler of Egypt but of Greek descent, in the ancient Greek text, and was able to find the corresponding cartouche in the Egyptian text, theorizing that Ptolemy would be spelt out phonetically in the hieroglyphs. And so he got to work. Young correctly identified the Ptolemy cartouche amongst the hieroglyphs and attributed phonetic values to the symbols. P, T, something that Young didn't believe had any phonetic value, Lo or Ol, Ma or M, I, Os or Osh.
So altogether, Young had these characters spell out the name Ptolemaeus, and he was right in that. He just wasn't right in the way the signs broke the sounds in Ptolemaeus down. And because he made certain mistakes in this, he wasn't unable to make any more progress. And so it fell to Champollion, who with his great knowledge of Coptic, the later stage of the Egyptian language, was going to be the one to make the ultimate breakthrough.
Champollion did his own work on the Ptolemy cartouche, but was helped with the discovery of another that was understood to belong to Cleopatra. He was able to compare the two cartouches and look for similarities in them, and therefore refine Young's work. P-T-O-L-M-E-S. K-L-E-O-P-A-T-R-A, and a symbol that denotes a feminine ending. By the end, he had correctly attributed the sound value of 12 symbols, but Champollion wanted to be sure that his discovery was correct.
Looking for other cartouches, Champollion noticed this one, which appeared everywhere at Abu Simbel. It features a circular sign, then something rather enigmatic looking, perhaps, and then the same sign repeated twice. Champollion guessed that the circular sign might be the sun, and he knew from Coptic that this had the sound Ra. Champollion knew that this sign and this one both had the phonetic value S, and he knew that because that sign crops up at the end of the Ptolemaeus cartouche in the Rosetta Stone. So if this was an S, we're looking at a name that begins with Ra and ends with 2 S's, Ses. And he guessed that the sign in between had the value Mes, which would give him the name Ramesses. This was a breakthrough moment for Champollion. He raced down the corridor to his brother's office, exclaiming, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it." And then he fainted. When he came round, he wrote a letter, and that letter is now famous for us Egyptologists. It's the Lettre à Monsieur Dacier.
The letter is a short academic text containing at its heart a table filled with hieroglyphs tallied against their ancient Greek and Demotic counterparts. It's this letter that became the founding text upon which ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs would be systematically deciphered.
The work done by Young and Champollion was truly magnificent. The decipherment, a watershed moment for Egyptology. For the first time, scholars could now start to understand the massive inscriptions that smothered the monuments they'd been looking at for the last few decades. And this brought about a kind of a mood change in Egyptology as well, as we moved from treasure hunters to historians.
The field of Egyptology was now no longer only about mysterious and beautiful objects. It had found its voice again. And it told us about great pharaohs, important battles, and grand mythologies. But as the world of ancient Egypt began to reveal its secrets, the way we went about collecting these magnificent objects was changing too. In 1850, a young Frenchman, Auguste Mariette, working for the Louvre, set off for Egypt on a collecting mission. Mariette made some wonderful discoveries which he happily shipped back to France, satisfied with a job well done for his employer.
In 1857, Mariette returned to Egypt. But once he was there, he learned that he wasn't going back as a great discoverer, but instead as little more than a thief. Now, of course, he could have just ignored the rules and regulations and the Egyptian officials as many had before and just carry on as he had in the past. But no, he didn't do that. Instead, he decided to repent.
Mariette continued his digging, of course, shifting tons of sand and debris from ancient temple complexes, but now in a new role as the conservator of Egyptian monuments. Instead of these finds being carted off to London and Paris, they were going to stay in Egypt. It was the beginning of the great Egyptian Museum in Cairo.
Despite all the good work done by Mariette, for many Egyptologists, his excavations weren't much better than Belzoni's. The finer details of archaeological sites were being bulldozed in favour of the more obvious treasures that were still waiting to be found. Nevertheless, in the late 1800s, things were going to improve. Egyptology was going scientific.
In 1873, the novelist Amelia Edwards, wanting to escape to warmer climes, travelled to Egypt. She rented a traditional Nile dahabeah and travelled along the Great River, taking in the famous Egyptian sites along the way.
Amelia fell in love with Egypt and she wrote this account of her travels, 1,000 miles up the Nile. It's filled with vivid descriptions and beautiful sketches of the things that she saw. But something troubled Amelia during her journey. The monuments she was seeing were rapidly falling into ruin.
Still riding on that wave of Egyptomania sparked by the stuffing of European museums with ancient Egyptian treasures, Western tourists were now flooding into the country. But as more tourists came, and more were tempted to take a little souvenir away with them, the more these irreplaceable monuments were being lost without having been accurately recorded for posterity.
Amelia decided to do something about this. On her return to England, she began educating herself on ancient Egypt, and she proposed to create a fund to send an explorer out to document the monuments properly before they were lost. In 1882, an announcement appeared in the Times heralding the foundation of the Egypt Exploration Fund. It's now known as the Egypt Exploration Society.
The fund would focus its attention on sites in the Nile Delta, an area that had been little explored but was covered in archaeological remains. Amelia was also able to garner support and vital funds from various religious leaders, cleverly raising the possibility that they might find evidence of places mentioned in the Old Testament. But make no mistake, the strategy was clear. Scientific rigour was the order of the day. The fund applied to the head of the Antiquities Service in Egypt for permission to dig, and they succeeded, becoming the first foreign institution to be allowed to excavate. And this really set a precedent to apply to the Antiquities Service for a permit. It's something that Egyptologists like me are very familiar with, even to this day. In 1883, the fund sent its first explorer to Egypt to begin digging. This was the Swiss academic Edouard Naville. I have here a letter from Naville to the fund, dated 12th of April 1882, and in it he accepts the position as the fund's first explorer, even though, as he says, he's perhaps not the most experienced. He says, "I cannot conceive anything more interesting for an Egyptologist than to make excavations." But a little way later he says, "I have hardly any experience of excavations. I do not know whether I am at all qualified for this kind of work." Naville really was an expert in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic texts, not an archaeologist, but in fairness to Naville, modern scientific archaeology as we understand it was still really only at a sort of embryonic stage. Naville was dispatched to the site of Tel El Maskuta, supposedly the site of the biblical city of Pithom, a key waypoint for the Exodus. A smart move by Amelia, who wanted to keep her religiously inclined backers firmly on side. The season was a success. Naville's excavations went well, and crucially, in accordance with Amelia's plans, all the remains were documented as they were found. Naville sent letters like this one back, with details of all the things that he'd discovered, and texts like this would then form the basis for the published accounts. The store city of Pithom and the route of the Exodus. No prizes for guessing who this was intended to appeal to. This is really important because it's the archaeological report of an excavation of an Egyptian site, and it's one of the very first. It contains descriptions, it contains analysis, there are epigraphic drawings of inscriptions, photographs of objects, there are maps. In fact, it's exactly the kind of report that I as an archaeologist would be familiar with using, even today, a century and a half later. This would provide the template for all archaeologists and institutions to follow. Finally, a blueprint was in place that could be followed by future Egyptologists. This was how you should approach a site and how you should be recording it. Not just for the sake of posterity, but so you could begin to understand it too. Naville obviously took to the work quite well, despite his lack of archaeological experience. But for me, the real star of the show here is Amelia Edwards. Here's somebody who had no formal training in Egyptology, and yet she had the vision to understand the importance of the monuments and of preserving them. And the importance also, the knowledge that could be gained from those sites and monuments, and of sharing it with the public as well. And this album of press cuttings, which she's annotated by hand herself, represents just the first few years of the EEF's existence. And it shows just how popular and successful that work was. And that's perhaps why for many people she's like a kind of godmother to Egyptology. But the fund wasn't finished. Amelia wanted to continue to send scholars back to Egypt. Naville was unavailable for a second season, and so a search for a replacement began. The candidate who emerged would be a man who would utterly revolutionise not just Egyptology, but the whole field of archaeology. William Matthew Flinders Petrie. From an early age, Flinders Petrie was showing all the qualities that would be needed of an archaeologist. He was hands-on, intelligent, and inventive. He was fascinated by the ancient world. By 19, he had accurately surveyed Stonehenge, but it was Egypt that truly fascinated him. In 1880, he travelled to Egypt and made the most accurate survey of the pyramids of Giza ever undertaken. His love of Egypt was now cemented, but He was horrified at the rate of destruction of the ancient monuments he was seeing. He described Egypt as being like a house on fire, and he was now determined to record as much of the remains as possible for posterity. He was the perfect fit for the EEF, and in 1884 he was dispatched to the site of Tanis. But Petrie's approach to Egypt was going to be totally unlike that of anyone before him, and would change how we understand Egyptology forever. The Petrie Museum houses one of the largest Egyptological collections anywhere in the world, and yet it's crammed into this fairly small space. And that's because Petrie himself wasn't just interested in the monumental, but also in the minuscule. Up until now, the aim of archaeology in Egypt had been to recover the treasures, the fine statues, brightly painted funerary items, and stele covered in texts. But what Petrie realised, and what had been ignored by thousands before him, was that everything on the site was an important piece of the puzzle, from the monumental obelisks to the humblest sherd of pottery. Flinders Petrie wanted to shine a light not just on pyramids and tombs, pharaohs and gods of ancient Egypt, but the whole world. But to do that, he was going to have to revolutionise the entire discipline. An excavation could no longer be about hauling tons of sand out of an area to uncover a tomb or temple. Meticulous clearing would have to be done so that everything could be accurately recorded, right down to the very smallest objects. Anything and everything could offer a clue as to how the site should be interpreted. And that meant collecting a lot of stuff. There are thousands and thousands of pots and potsherds like these in this collection. And at first glance, they might not look that impressive. If you imagine somebody digging up a colossal statue of a god, you can see how perhaps they wouldn't have found things like this so appealing. But Petrie realised that material like this could be the key to opening up the ancient world. He had the vision and the intellect to devise a system that would allow him to use pottery to establish the chronology of the ancient sites he was working at. So now, with this system, he could understand how long a site like Tanis had been occupied for, or when a house was built, or a grave dug. And this was a massive leap forwards towards modern scientific archaeology. Petrie took photographs, now a standard part of the archaeological process, and made detailed sketches of everything, all in an effort to fully understand the sites he was working at and the people who once inhabited them. Flinders Petrie's excavations took him throughout Egypt and into Palestine, allowing him to spread his new archaeological methods far and wide. And he's still a massive, looming presence in Egyptology even today. He introduced new standards of practice that are commonplace, opened up new avenues of research looking at aspects of Egyptian culture that nobody had really been interested in before. So much of what we know about ancient Egypt today is thanks to Flinders Petrie. The world of Egyptology had been blown wide open, and it would be the followers of Petrie's methods who would drive the discipline into the 20th century. And of course, it was fitting that one of his apprentices would make the most famous Egyptological discovery of all time. Howard Carter was a talented young artist who, like many other boys in the late 1800s, had fallen in love with ancient Egypt. And in 1891, aged just 17, he visited the Nile Valley with the Egypt Exploration Fund as an apprentice tasked with making accurate copies of the decoration on the walls of tombs. And it was at the end of that first season that he was seconded to Flinders Petrie.
these are some of the original paintings made by Howard Carter in Egypt. So we've got some of the details from the decoration in the walls of tombs to a beautifully painted relief of an Egyptian queen. And they certainly speak to the talent that Carter had himself as an artist, and it's probably fair to say he was quite proud of these works of art himself. He's initialed this one, his signature's on this one. But they're also of academic value as well, and it's for that reason that these drawings also crop up in reports like this one. They are illustrations that were part of, as it says on the front, a contribution to the history of Egyptian writing. So these are part of the Egypt Exploration Fund's accurate recording of Egyptian sites and monuments. They have academic value as well as aesthetic value.
But it wasn't long before Carter made himself so much more than just a draftsman. He became a talented archaeologist in his own right, very much in the mould of Flinders Petrie. And in 1907, he began working with a new benefactor, Lord Carnarvon. It was the start of a relationship that would last for the next 16 years. But it wasn't always successful.
After years of drawing blanks, and with Lord Carnarvon threatening to withdraw the funding, Carter persuaded him that they should have one final season in the Valley of Kings.
On the 4th of November 1922, a step was uncovered. Excavations revealed a descending passageway, and at the bottom, a sealed door was discovered.
An urgent message was sent back to Lord Carnarvon, and in 2.5 weeks he was on site to see the staircase re-excavated and the door removed.
On the 26th of November, Carter made a tiny breach in the door leading to the inner chamber, fittingly using a chisel given to him by his grandmother on his 17th birthday, the same year that he met Petrie and his life as an Egyptologist began. What was uttered next is perhaps the most famous exchange in all of archaeological history.
Carter lifted his candle to the hole and peered through. Lord Carnarvon asked him, "Can you see anything?" To which Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things."
The discovery of Tutankhamun sparked another tidal wave of Egyptomania across the globe. The stunning death mask gave ancient Egypt an instantly recognizable face.
The work done by Howard Carter is rightfully considered a high watermark for Egyptology. It was the culmination of centuries of development in the discipline, and Carter himself embodies the buccaneering spirit of Belzoni, the curiosity of Napoleon's savants, and of course the rigour of Flinders Petrie.
But of course, since that day in November 1922, Egyptology hasn't stopped, thankfully for me. Since then, more modern techniques have been employed. Geophysics, satellite imaging and digital unwrapping of mummies have all turned up stunning finds that have helped us make the mysterious world of ancient Egypt a little less mysterious.
But even though our techniques and our motivations might have changed, all of us Egyptologists have one thing in common. From intrepid George Sands to the genius Champollion, the treasure hunter Belzoni, to the pioneer Flinders Petrie, right down to Egyptologists in the modern day like me, we all want to know ancient Egypt. And maybe, just maybe, get a Howard Carter moment of our own.
So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that. As I said at the top, it was so much fun to make. It's great watching it back. I think it turned out really well. And I hope you did too. Let us know. We had, I think, just short of 500 people in the stream, which is fantastic. Thank you all for coming. As I said before, we've had people from all around the world, which is really, really gratifying. And I know that we've had a lot of questions come in as well. So over the course of the next half an hour or so, something like that, Mark, Milo, and I will do our best to answer your questions. I'm not sure that we're going to get to them all. I don't want to overpromise. We'll get through as many as we can. And some of them, at least, are not questions that we could answer in full very briefly. So apologies in advance if we skip through some of these, what seems like in some haste, but we'll do our best anyway. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed it. We loved making it. It was great seeing it again. And it is really great to see that the film has prompted so many of your questions. So without any further ado, and apologies also if I don't mention people by name. I'm not always seeing here everybody's names. I'll try and say hellos where I can, but apologies if I don't always do that. The first question I've got here is how and why did you get into Egyptology in the first place? As the only Egyptologist on the panel, I guess that's the question for me. although Mark and Milo, feel free to chip in. So I got into it essentially because and I'm not just saying this, really loved watching documentaries about ancient Egypt when I was a teenager. I've always been a bit of a history buff. My family was full of history buffs. We did lots of sort of summer holidays in castles and museums and that sort of thing up and down the country. When it came to choosing what I wanted to do after school, I wanted to try and do something about sort of ancient history, archaeology, and I had an interest in ancient Egypt too. So I went off to university to study ancient history and archaeology, actually, but at a place, University of Birmingham, where they taught Egyptology. At that time, I had just about given up the dream of playing for Arsenal. My main aim in life was to join a rock band. Radiohead was the one I really wanted to join. And other than that, I thought, if none of those other things happened for me, then maybe I'd try and make a career in Egyptology. And so long story short, I'm still doing it 26 years later. And still expecting that at some point I'm going to get rumbled and I'll have to get a real job. But so far, so good. Mark Gomez asked, if you could solve any mystery of ancient Egypt, what would it be? And sort of sub-question, Worsey Peepees asks, hi guys, is there truly a library inside the Sphinx? So maybe to take that second one, first of all, there are some mysterious sort of openings in the Sphinx, and even the odd cavity here and there, but they have been thoroughly investigated and not found to contain any kind of library. There are sort of myths and legends that there's a lost library full of ancient knowledge somewhere around the Sphinx, but of course it's been thoroughly looked over and there appears to be no such thing. If I could solve any mystery of ancient Egypt, it would probably be a tomb-related mystery, and if I had to pick one, it would probably be where Nefertiti was buried, which has been a bit of a preoccupation of mine over the last few years, as some of you might know. This is more a question, I guess, related to the sorts of things that we were talking about in the documentary. But looking forwards to the future rather than back into the story of Egyptology, the history of Egyptology. What technological or scientific breakthrough do you think is needed to change the field of Egyptology? That's actually a very tricky question. I mean, it's a daft answer maybe, but I often think that if there was some way, if we discovered that there was some way that people could sort of leave traces of things they said or things they thought it would be really great to try and understand. I find myself often saying to people, we can't really understand what the motivations of, say, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten were in completely upending Egyptian religion and religious practice. If there was some way that we could find a trace of Akhenaten's thought process, then that would be really great. But I mean, I have no idea how that could ever happen. Guys, of all the sort of stuff that we talked about in the film, and thinking back to sort of George Sands and arriving in Alexandria with his more or less his sort of tape measure and that sort of stuff, do you have kind of favorite I don't know, stories of technological breakthroughs that helped our story along?
Well, I mean, I think the Belzoni story is obviously such a great one, and that was so closely entwined with his knowledge of engineering, and that, despite him being a questionable character and the work that he'd been doing was being questionable, that undoubtedly opened up the Egyptological world so much. So I'd say that really was. I mean, and just having seen the bust of the younger Memnon and seeing how big it is and how tough it must have been to move across sand and then down the Nile, just being able to do that sort of industrially was really, really impressive piece of work.
It reminds me of a favourite story of mine about the collections in the British Museum. I know that the curatorial team there would really love to rearrange everything in that gallery, where we were just talking earlier about how much fun it was shooting after hours in the sculpture gallery. I know the curatorial team would love to just move everything around, because the displays haven't changed for about 30, 40 years. They can't, because the stuff is too heavy and they just can't move it. So, that, if nothing else, gives you kind of an in, doesn't it, I think, into Belzoni's achievements. We have actually next a question. This is quite a nice segue over to Milo, I think. It's a question from Eleanor Williams. Hi, Eleanor. What camera, Milo, did you use? And was sand an issue?
That's a good question. We used a couple of cameras. Most of the stuff we used, we shot Chris on a Sony FS5 camera for the dull answer. But then we used a few different lenses, some newer ones and some old ones. My favourite being the Cosmic Drain Pipe, which is the very long end lens, which makes everything look quite exciting. And then we used a smaller camera on the gimbal for the sort of moving shots, and then one of Mark's GoPros for a few other bits and pieces. So it's got a mix and a match, and then trying to make it all looks sort of the same colorway and stuff in the edit, with not loads of time to do it in was quite a challenge. But I'm glad you liked it. Thanks very much, Eleanor. Cheers.
Mark, what can we say about sand?
Oh yes.
Milo, what can we say about sand?
Go on, Milo.
It was more cold really than sand, wasn't it? Because a few times I couldn't actually press any buttons, and we didn't get to go to Egypt, which is the crazy thing about the whole. Some people got to. Yeah, no, there wasn't any sand on our job, and we got a very good Hoover, very small one.
Yeah, we should maybe say that this is, in some ways, this was a kind of lockdown project. It was conceived when the world was very much in lockdown. And filming projects like this were incredibly difficult, as I'm sure you can imagine, and certainly filming projects that involved travel overseas were extremely difficult. So the shoot took place over the course of a week or so in January and February, which is why we keep talking about why it was so cold. And yeah, Mark, the footage from Egypt. How did we get footage from Egypt?
Well, it was a mixture really of you being at the right place at the right time with a camera, which was very handy, and then some additional bought-in archive footage. But I guess the thing about it is, touching on the fact that it was a lockdown project, we were really keen as History Hit to have Egyptology as a topic on the channel. But how do you tell the story of an Egypt story without going to Egypt? And so this seemed to be one of the best ways to do it. So that's why we ended up spending several very cold days in London, sort of dreaming of the hot sands and the warm winds of the Sahara Desert blowing in our faces. So it was a creative challenge, but I think if you were to be stuck anywhere in the world and you couldn't go to Egypt London is probably one of the better places to be stuck for an Egyptology film.
Yeah, that is certainly true. Yes. So moving on, History of Granite asks, this is a very interesting question. What do you make of the trend for attacking early Egyptologists as colonialists? I mean, this is such an important question, and it's such a big discussion, and we're not really going to be able to do it justice in the time we have here. I mean, we did try and tackle this a little bit in the film. We talked about Belzoni being problematic. He's just perhaps one of the most visible and obvious examples of, somebody who was responsible for removing antiquities on a very large scale from Egypt without the compliance of the Egyptian people. And this all played out, of course, at a time when Europeans were imposing themselves on the country, and much of Egyptology has. I mean, my own view is that we need to understand the history of how this played out, and that, the discussion on this is, as I say, is much too big and complicated for us to be able to go into it in detail in this Q&A, and actually it's really too big and complicated for us to go into it in the film in very much detail as well. But I think for me, what's important about the film is to give people a way into understanding how Egyptology has played out, and I like to think that we were able to seed enough of these thoughts for people to be sort of aware of the issues, and maybe to take them further. Is that fair, Mark? Do you think? I mean, as the script writer and storyteller.
Yeah, I think so. I think we spoke about it quite a lot in the production process of how to, we've got an hour to tell 1,000 years of history, a quite complicated history at times, and so we've got to sort of pick your battles, and you've got to be able to sort of pick your way through to be able to tell an engaging story, but also to be able to touch on those points. I think we definitely did do that, and like you say, I think we can't be exhaustive in all of the sort of the nooks and crannies of this story, and so I think what we did was we illuminated bits that then people can then delve into a bit more. So the story of Belzoni is a good one. He obviously did a lot of amazing work, but he also stripped Egypt of lots of its treasures, and so now people can maybe take that a bit further and find out, well, why did he do that, or what was the impact of that? And I think that's that was the best way that we could manage it on such a limited amount of time in the film, and also limited locations that we could get to as well.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, I think if you just think about the Rosetta Stone, was it in an abandoned Turkish fort that the French found and the English nicked it, and it was done with Egyptian, Greek, and something else on. So it's like, over time, loads of different empires have laid claim to certain things, and how they distribute them or return them or whatever is I don't know, it's very, very complex. But I think it's a dialogue that needs to start and happen and have some sort of solution in our lifetime. I don't know how best that to happen, other than people know more about the subject, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think. Yeah, I think we just need to understand it. I think that's the important thing. I like to think that's what we're doing here with this film as well. This is a contribution to starting that discussion. But yeah, it's such a big. Yeah, I think you said the word, Milo. It's such a complicated thing, and I hope people won't feel as though we didn't undersell the importance of that. But it is tricky and very complicated. And in the end, we had an hour to get all of this sort of 200 years of history into, and more, into this film. Maybe that's a reason for doing a sequel.
Yes.
Kind of follow-up question to that. Federico asks, was the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb as important to the field of Egyptology as we assume today? I think my feeling on this is that probably not. I'm not sure that it I'm not sure that it affected academic Egyptology, at least initially. I think its impact was much more on the public sort of perception, and there's no question that it brought people, including me, into the subject, and that started to happen from the moment the news hit the newspapers. I think there will have been people who who read about this and kind of went, oh my goodness, I want to get involved. Having said that, it led to a change in the antiquities laws, and prior to that point, excavators like Carter and Carnarvon would have been entitled to ask for a share of the antiquities to take away for themselves, and they were assuming, Carter and Carnarvon, that that's what would happen, and it didn't. And the law was changed at that point to give the Antiquities Service more clout in saying, actually, sorry, no, we're not letting you have any stuff. And that was a movement towards the situation we've had since 1983, where nothing leaves now, which I think everybody would agree now is exactly the right way. So yeah, that is also complicated. I mean, gosh, we used it as our starting point, didn't we? But
it is, yeah.
We could have done a whole film about Tutankhamun, don't you think?
I think we could have done. I think we could have done a film about everybody that we spoke about.
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
I think Tutankhamun, obviously, like you said, to me, it's hugely important because I wrote the script, so it is what I think. But I do think that when people think of Egyptology, they immediately think of Tutankhamun. I mean, or it must be at least in their top 5, on with pyramids, Sphinx, maybe Nefertiti. But then you might be starting sort of Cleopatra, and that must have had an impact on Egyptology, and therefore on the academic side of it as well, because it could have been that person that read that then led to that, and you'll sort of never know that through story. So I guess it just adds anything that sort of publicized Egyptology at such a crucial moment as well in time, just before sort of big technological and scientific explosions sort of happened throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, I think so. Tom asks, which early Egyptologists do you admire the most and why? I'm going to ask Milo on the basis of our film. Do you have a favorite character from our film?
That's a very good question. What? I suppose it was sort of rated for different reasons, but I think Amelia
Edwards, yeah.
The fact that she was so keen on on sort of capturing everything without it just disappearing, and managed to use her skills and charms and ways to get people to invest in making that happen, I think is really interesting. I think it's very sort of contemporary, and it's someone's own sort of nous to do that rather than any big organization is very impressive, I think.
Mark, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I think, watching the film back again, I was just so taken by that George Sand's book. I think just the drawings in there, the way that he wrote about it, everything that going and doing it when it was just the other end of the world. It must have just been absolutely extraordinary for him to have been there and to see those things, and then to come back and then draw these. Well, I mean, to us, they look pretty crude, the drawings, but they just, we were really lucky enough to be able to go and see it in person, but there was a real, we were all, I think, really quite taken by the book. It was only quite small, but it was just so nice to see, like Chris says in the film, also at the beginning of modern Egyptology right there in that book. That was really exciting.
Yeah, that was an amazing moment for me. Seeing his signature. I mean,
yeah.
And I, as so often with these things, I didn't know until we were there. That it's not like 6 months beforehand somebody said, "Oh, we've secured permission to use a copy of George Sand's book," and he's autographed it. I didn't know that until we were there. And then you don't get, again with these things, time is always so tight, isn't it? When you don't get sort of 2 hours to pore over it, you get you get 2 minutes to look at it, and while while Milo's setting up or whatever, and then you just got to get on with it and go. And actually, we were saying, this is a tiny little aside, isn't it? But we were saying earlier that the sequences that we did at the London Library were the last ones we did in the main block of filming, and some of that was done on a Friday night at about, what did we finish, about 10:30 at night, and we were all a bit by then. So
we were a bit brain melted, but it was 10 o'clock at night. We got the sort of the graveyard slot after the library had closed from sort of 5 till 10.
Yeah,
to rattle through stuff. So it always the way. We never get enough time with these amazing things. Well, it's nice to surprise Chris with a little treat dangling at the end of the week there. A little surprise for him.
But when there two copies there, one
there
was
were.
and one wasn't. So
That's right,
we've got two knocking about.
That's right. That's right.
He's the really good one, by the way.
Yeah, amazing.
They're so
Thank
friendly
you
in there
for
too.
that.
Yeah, the library, the people in there were unbelievably kind and helpful. Because normally when you go somewhere like that, you can't even have one book next to another book, or you got to wear some gloves, and you're kind of, it sort of defeats the whole point of going to see it sometimes. But there, they said, pick it up, check it out. Here's that, and they were as excited about it as we were. It's mega, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, it was really great. Makes the whole thing much easier, doesn't it? Okay. So, Chris, what's the closest you've come to as an Egyptologist to having a Howard Carter moment? I would have to say, and actually this was connected with the TV project as well. A few years ago, 2017, I was asked to go out to the site of Dashur for a filming project to visit an excavation of essentially it looked like a limestone square, a square made of blocks of very bright white limestone, which turned out to be the base of a pyramid. And in the center of that was what looked like a typical late Middle Kingdom, early Second Intermediate Period burial chamber, which appeared to be intact. I genuinely didn't know very much about the site, and that was deliberate on the part of the crew because they wanted to be able to film me wandering around trying to figure out what it was, for some real sort of spontaneous stuff. And it turned out, as part of the filming project, they were going to open the burial chamber, and because it appeared to be intact, we were all hoping that there would be a very nice Howard Carter moment to be had, and somehow we still don't really understand how, despite the fact that the granite blocking stones were all in place, the burial was disturbed. So in fact, some of you may have seen the film. It's called Egypt's Lost Pyramid. It went on out on Channel 4 in the UK in 2019. We concluded that the burial may well have been violated before the tomb was sealed, and that the last thing the corrupt priests perhaps did was to seal the thing and then sort of go, oh well, there you go, job done, all sealed and intact, don't worry about that, don't go looking in there, folks, because it's all fine and dandy and nothing to worry about, see you later. But we don't know anyway. So that I can't say that was a Howard Carter moment, but that's probably the closest I've got.
Chris, I've got a question for you.
Yes.
How did you feel when you got so close to what you thought was an undisturbed tomb, and then that's what you found when you went inside?
Well, I suppose you'd think disappointed, wouldn't you? And actually, I really wasn't, because it wasn't empty. It wasn't empty as in, spotlessly clean. There were remains of a canopic box, just not quite in position. It was in the wrong place. There wasn't initially any obvious evidence of a burial, but I don't know if I was the first person to see this or not. I'm not completely sure, because it wasn't just me on the site. There were a lot of other people, crew, archaeologists, conservators. But I stuck an arm in between two granite pieces, one of which had been raised up, with my phone, the camera from my phone, because I couldn't look kind of down, immediately downwards, because I couldn't get in enough, but I could get an arm in. that would be the moment in the sort of Hollywood version where the chain kind of goes gadang. Anyway, that didn't happen. And I just took a photo and then just dragged the camera out to see what there was, and it was the lid of a coffin of a classic sort of Middle Kingdom coffin of a high status woman. We assume this was the coffin of a princess. So actually, for all that, it wasn't all gold and bling and all intact, which would I can't tell you how I would have reacted if it was intact. It wasn't, which is what you'd normally expect, but there was stuff there, and so it was still amazing. Having said that, sorry, I'm aware that I shouldn't go rambling on forever, but I did see the intact deposit in Kings Valley Tomb 63 in 2006, just shortly after that was discovered, and everything, 7 coffins and 21 jars and various other things, all there and exactly in place as they've been left in the late 18th dynasty, probably shortly after the death of Tutankhamun. And I can remember a colleague who was there with me, who was had asked me to, invited me along to go and see it, said, "You can go closer." And I didn't realize, but I was completely sort of mesmerized by it and didn't want to go any nearer, because it was like I can only describe it as being like meeting a celebrity, like meeting a famous person. It was as if ancient Egypt was there in front of me, and that probably was maybe that should have been my Howard Carter moment.
How many years ago would it have been sealed up, those 2 tombs?
So in the case of the pyramid, it would have been sealed for just short of 4,000 years. In the case of the Kings Valley 63, more like 3.5. Again, slightly less than.
Only 3,500.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that was a modern one. Anyway,
but you did have your Howard Carter moment though, because you holding your phone over the side is exactly like him putting his candle up to the hole.
Maybe that's the modern equivalent. Yeah. Somebody should have asked me, "Can you see anything?" And I would have said yes, but just a second.
My phone is buffering.
Yeah. So we should go back to the to questions from the floor. So Gan asks, do you think conservation has reached a point where we guarantee antiquities discovered today will last another millennium? Ooh. Sadly, I don't. And I only say that because the lesson of the last 200 years is that just when you think clever old archaeologists have rediscovered things and we can all live happily ever after, and everything can be preserved in aspic, we know that it doesn't work like that. So there are sites and monuments which were recorded in those enormous volumes of the Description de l'Egypte that we went to visit in the house of the Robert Anderson Trust. Some of those things, I'm sure we talked about this at the time, didn't we, guys? Some of those things are now either at least changed and in some cases totally disappeared. Think of the things that were, for example, in the collection of the Liverpool Museum that was bombed in the Second World War. I'm not saying I expect there will be bombings or temples will be turned into sugar factories, as sometimes happened in the 19th century. But like I say, so Milo Mark, we're talking just now about how long ago it was that those things we were just talking about, pyramids and tombs, had survived intact thousands of years. The same goes for all those other things I've just been talking about, and how long since they were discovered or rediscovered in the modern era was it since they were completely lost? A few decades. So I kind of feel like that, technically, yes, maybe we're approaching the point where we could say that we could, in theory, it's possible to preserve things, but I don't think they'll survive. Is that too pessimistic, guys? Do you think, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's such a long, thousands of years is a bloody long time, isn't it? You know what I mean? So anything could happen to it. There could be another ice age, or who knows what. So it's and also, would you digitize everything, and then how do you store the digital version? Would that disappear? Who knows? So it's kind of
that if anything is maybe the best hope, I think. preserving things digitally, which is obviously happening all the time, 3D scanning and archives being digitized. But yeah, I'm not convinced these things will survive.
And I think sort of attaching the story to them, like you do, Chris, as an Egyptologist, giving them a sense of sort of relation to each other and what they mean, is more than the actual artifacts themselves in a way. You know what I mean? Like there's a question there about the Rosetta Stone. Sort of that's the physical code breaking thing. But now the code's been broken, we don't really need the stone. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, actually, and in fact, I was really glad that you chose Amelia Edwards as your kind of favorite, because as a former director of the EES, she's kind of everyone's favorite at the EES, and it's funny how we all call her Amelia, where everybody else just gets called by their surname. It's a little bit as though we've got sort of extra affection for Amelia Edwards. But her thing, as you mentioned, or a big part of her mission, if you like, was this hammering away at this idea that you've got to publish, and you've got to. It's no good just rescuing the stuff, but you've got to document it, and we tried really hard, didn't we, to get that point across? I think really, really clearly. You document it, and then you, like you say, Milo, you sort of tell stories about it. I should maybe say that I wrote when we were first discussing this, or first trying to agree how the story would be told. I wrote a script in inverted commas, which was actually a very, very long-winded essay, which I sent to Mark. Mark turned into a real script. So, but I was really, I'm hugely grateful to Mark and obviously to Milo as well for making the story into the film that you see. But that element, I think, Mark, of that idea of documenting stuff and telling the stories, like Milo, as Milo sort of puts it, that was obvious to you. It was really a big part of the story, I think.
Yeah, I hopefully that came across as well. That's sort of, to me, sort of front and center almost really of everything. It's all about the documentation of things, because we were sort of following that story of Egyptology, and as we met a new person or a new event, that was adding an extra little element, into that story. And I guess with Amelia particularly, that idea of documenting your finds, and we're talking about conservation, and she was there in what sort of 150 years ago, something like that, seeing these things falling apart, and and being shocked by it, and so, and we have to be, we're obviously extremely grateful that people like her were there at that really critical point and said, well, we've got to stop doing this, because otherwise we wouldn't have anything, and Chris wouldn't have a career, Arsenal would have a fledgling recruit instead, and so so we are in the debt of these people who had the foresight to think, hang on, if we don't stop this, if we don't start to conserve these things, and start to, like Milo says, telling stories about them, which makes people then, that isn't just a building, that's where these things happened, that's where this important event in your history happened, that's how we can then preserve it, and hopefully there are still enough people today that have that mindset still, and still want to preserve things. So will they still be? I couldn't tell you about the technical aspect of conservation, but I'd like to be optimistic and think that a millennia from now, people will still be able to go and look at the pyramids and think, oh, that one's quite a young one, because that's only 4,500 years old, and that one's 5,000 years old. Hopefully.
Yeah. I think I don't think we're going to be expecting that everything will disappear. Hopefully not, but who knows? Actually, though, something you said just now, Mark, actually is a really nice lead into what I think is going to have to be our final question. Thinking about the importance of Amelia Edwards and inspiring people, and we talked a little bit earlier, didn't we, as well, about when we were talking about sort of favorite characters, about being inspired. And the final question is, what's your advice on how young people can get into Egyptology via school and university? which is a nice question. And actually thinking about the future and the survival of things, you know, we are going to need for people to take up the baton and carry on the mission started off by Sands and continued by Amelia and Flinders Petrie and we three amigos, storytellers of the history of Egyptology. I'll try to answer this relatively briefly. Most Egyptologists are academically trained in Egyptology, so you do need to go to university to study, if not Egyptology, then something related like archaeology, ancient history, classics is perhaps also a way in. There aren't very many places that offer Egyptology degrees. Most of the time you would be studying something related and then specializing within that in Egyptology. That's what I did. Most Egyptologists who earn a living are trained up to PhD level. So it's a big commitment. But my advice would be, Egyptology is never going to make you millions. I remember sitting opposite somebody like a stockbroker or something at a party once, and I could tell that he had a lot of money, and I knew what he did for a living. And he said to me, "What do you do?" You know, a bit of small talk. And I said, "Oh, Egyptology." The reaction to that is usually either "Wow, that's amazing," or "What?" And he just said, "Any money in that?" And I just thought, no, that's not why you do it. You do it because you love it. So I would say, if you're thinking seriously about it, have a look at what if you're still at school, have a look at what courses might lead you in the direction of kind of ancient history and archaeology, Egyptology. So you're probably thinking about history, classics. There are archaeology A levels that you can do in various places. But however far you take your studies, don't bank on making a career from it. Don't bank on having lots of money or job security. Remember at all times that you're doing this because you love it, and do it with it in mind, that you take it as far as you can. And if life takes you off in different directions, you can always have it there as a passion. If you're lucky enough to scrabble together a living from it, then all to the good. But you've got to make sure you love doing it. And I left my last salaried position to go freelance precisely because I had got to the sort of level of management where I wasn't doing enough Egyptology anymore. I wasn't doing enough ancient Egypt, and I sort of realized I've drifted away from what it is I really want to do. So I decided to go freelance, knowing that I might not be able to make it work. And that's partly why I say, I spend so much of my time thinking, at any point I'm going to get rumbled and I won't be able to do this anymore. But at least I know I'm still doing what it is that I fell in love with when I was 14 or something. And whether or not I managed to cobble together a career from it, or I have to go and work in a garden centre or a bike shop or something, I will still have it there as the thing I love. So if that's not too nauseating, that would be my advice. And with that, I think you've certainly had enough from me. I think we're at the end of the question. So I just want to say thanks again to everybody for coming. Thanks for watching the film. It means a lot to us all, I think, that you've been able to see it. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for your questions. It's really great to know that you were engaged with the subject. I'm sorry we couldn't take all the questions, and we certainly couldn't go into as much detail as we would have liked. If you have questions that you really must have answered, that you're not going to be able to sleep because of not having them answered this evening, certainly you're welcome to get in touch with me via social media at Chris Naunton, or my website www.chrisnaunton.com. I'd be happy to take your questions whenever they arrive. And otherwise, I think just a big thank you to Mark and Milo for being such a pleasure to work with, and for turning this story into such a, as far as I'm concerned, great film. So thank you guys, and thank you to everybody at History Hit for making this work. And by that I mean the film and also the event this evening. It definitely has been a lot more slick and a lot less clunky than it would have been if I'd been sellotaping the whole thing together on me Todd. So thanks from me over and out, and I think Mark is just going to say a few words to close the session.
Yeah, just thanks again, everybody, for joining us, whether you've joined us live or you're joining us in the future watching this on the History Hit YouTube channel. We really appreciate it, and thanks again for Chris for being the driving force behind not just the film but also behind our little catch-up this evening. It's been really fun, and it's been great to watch the film back and do our own director's commentary behind the scenes, which, you know, maybe we can do another event after this where we just talk all the way through it. Maybe watch that. Yeah. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed it. And again, you know, if you like history and you've enjoyed this, then please subscribe to the YouTube channel and go and follow us over on the History Hit TV channel as well, where we've got documentaries like this one and from every other period of history you could possibly think of. And if you do subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll get 50% off your first 3 months at History Hit TV with the code, the very secret code, YouTube. So but thanks again, everybody, and yeah, we'll hopefully more Egyptology hopefully come to the channel very soon. Thanks very much, and good night.